Welcome to Hearth and History. Tonight, we're stepping through the service corridor of a country house on a cold autumn evening, into a small warm room that smells of dried lavender and cooked fruit and old stone. Before we settle in, I'd like to ask, what's the sound that makes you feel most at home? A kettle, a crackling fire, perhaps rain on glass. Tell me in the comments. Now, make yourself comfortable. Take a breath. Let the evening come to you. The corridor from the kitchen is cooler at this hour, the flagstones carrying the chill of a house that has begun to settle around its fires for the night. She walks it with one hand cupped around the taper flame, the other steadying the ring of keys at her waist so they do not knock against each other in the quiet. The kitchen behind her is almost empty now. The cook has gone up. The scullery maid is finishing the last of the copper pans somewhere out of sight, and the soft, rhythmic sound of scrubbing follows her a little way down the passage before it fades. The stillroom door is plain oak, darker than the rest from years of absorbed warmth and steam, and she lifts the latch with the heel of her hand because her fingers are full. The door swings inward, and the room greets her the way it always does, with a breath of dried lavender and old sugar and the faint mineral coolness of stone that has sat unwarmed since morning. She steps inside, nudges the door closed with her hip, and the corridor disappears. The room is small, low-ceilinged, with beams that she could touch if she raised her hand, and 3 walls of shelves holding rows of glass jars, stoneware crocks, and brown bottles with cork stoppers, each one labeled in the housekeeper's careful hand or in her own. The 4th wall holds the range, a smaller, older one than the kitchen's, set deep into the stonework with a blackened iron door and a chimney that draws well when the wind is right. Tonight, the fire inside it has burned down to a thin orange line along the grate, barely enough to see by, and the room sits in near darkness. She crosses to the range first. The taper throws her shadow long and soft against the far wall as she crouches and opens the iron door, and the smell of spent coal comes up, dry and chalky. A handful of kindling from the box beside the hearth. 2 pieces of coal from the scuttle, each one placed rather than dropped, so the sound is a soft knock rather than a clatter. She leaves the draught open and straightens up, and already the kindling has begun to crackle, a thin, bright sound that fills the room the way a voice would. Now the candle. She touches the taper to the wick of the thick beeswax candlestick on the work table, and the flame catches and steadies and sends a warm circle of light across the scored oak surface. She pinches the taper out between wetted fingers, a quick sting of heat and then nothing, and she sets it aside on the edge of the table. The work table is the center of everything. Wide and heavy, its surface scarred with years of knife marks and stained with fruit juice that no amount of scrubbing has fully lifted. Plum, damson, black currant, quince. The wood carries the ghost of every autumn she has worked here, and the ones before her too. Tonight it holds what she laid out before supper. The broad copper pan of apple jelly, still faintly warm under its cloth cover. A row of clean glass jars, 8 of them, each one washed and dried and turned upside down on a folded linen cloth. A stoneware bowl with a muslin square draped across its mouth. A small saucer. A ball of kitchen string. A sheet of waxed paper. Her pen and ink in their wooden tray, and a neat stack of paper labels cut to size. Everything in its place. Everything ready. At the far end of the table, on a slab of cool gray stone, the quince paste she poured this morning sits in a shallow wooden frame. She goes to it now and leans down and breathes it in, that deep, sweet, rosy warmth that quince gives off when it has cooked for hours and turned from pale gold to a dark, clear red. She presses the surface with the pad of one fingertip. Still soft, still yielding, though less than it was at midday. It will need the night to set fully, and she will check it again before she leaves. She ties on her apron. It is heavier than the ones the kitchen maids wear, a dense, unbleached linen that falls past her knees and ties twice around her waist. The fabric is stiff from washing and smells of starch and dried rosemary from the shelf where it hangs. She smooths it flat across the front with both palms, a gesture that is less about neatness than about readiness, the way a carpenter might run a hand along a planed board before beginning work. The range has found its voice now. The coal has caught, and the fire is building steadily behind the iron door, sending warmth out across the stone floor in a slow, spreading tide that she can feel through the soles of her shoes. The room is changing around her, the chill lifting, the candlelight reaching the jars on the nearest shelf and catching there, small points of reflected gold in the glass. The dried herbs overhead have begun to release their scent as the air warms, and the room fills with it. Lavender and thyme, and the woody, resinous edge of rosemary, layering over the sweetness of the quince paste and the clean, sharp smell of the coal smoke. She stands at the table for a moment with her hands resting flat on the oak, palms down, feeling the scored grain of it under her fingers and the faint warmth beginning to rise through the wood from the room itself. The evening's work is spread before her. The jars, the fruit, the muslin cloth, the pen and ink. There is no hurry. The house above her is moving toward bed, and the stillroom is hers until the last jar is sealed and shelved, and the fire is banked and the candle is low. She reaches for the copper pan and lifts the cloth, and the apple jelly beneath it catches the candlelight all at once, a deep, trembling gold that holds the flame in its surface, the way a still pond holds the sky. The jelly has cooled since she left it before supper, but it has not yet begun to set. When she tilts the pan gently, it moves in a slow, heavy wave from one side to the other, thick and clear, and the scent that rises from it is sharp and sweet and layered with the clove and cinnamon she added hours ago when the apples were still whole and bobbing in the water. But the damsons come first. They have been simmering on the range since mid-afternoon, and when she wraps a cloth around the handle of the smaller pan and lifts the lid, The steam that rises is dark and rich and faintly sour, carrying with it the deep purple smell of fruit that has given up everything it had to the heat. The damsons have collapsed into a soft, formless mass, their skins split and curling, the stones loose among them. She carries the pan to the table with both hands, feeling the weight of it settle against her wrists, and sets it down beside the stoneware bowl. The muslin is already draped across the bowl's mouth, its edges hanging over the rim. She has done this 100 times, and her hands know the shape of it without thinking, gathering the muslin at the corners and tucking it down so it forms a shallow cradle that will hold the fruit and let only the syrup pass through. She lifts the pan again and pours slowly, tipping it just enough that the hot fruit slides forward in a mass and settles into the muslin with a soft, wet sound. The syrup begins to seep through at once, a thin, dark thread that drops into the bowl below and pools there, almost black in the low light. She does not press. She does not squeeze the cloth or push the fruit down with a spoon, because she learned long ago and has never forgotten that pressing clouds the syrup and turns it from something clear and beautiful into something muddy and dull. Patience is the only tool required here. The muslin will do its work through the evening, and by the time she is ready to leave, the bowl will hold a syrup so clear she could read a label through it. She sets the empty pan aside and wipes her hands on the cloth that hangs from the table edge, and her fingers come away stained, the tips dark with damson juice that will not wash out fully until tomorrow. Now the apple jelly. She turns the first jar right side up and holds it for a moment, feeling the cool, smooth glass against her palms. It is a small jar, a half-pint, the kind the housekeeper prefers for gifts and for the breakfast table upstairs. The glass is clear and clean and faintly green in the candlelight. She sets it on the table beside the copper pan and reaches for the ladle. The first spoonful of jelly lifts from the pan in a slow, trembling arc, heavy and golden, and she pours it into the jar in a single steady stream, watching the level rise against the glass. The jelly is still warm enough to pour, but cool enough to hold its shape, and it settles into the jar with a faint shudder, and then goes still. She fills the jar to within a finger's width of the rim, the way the housekeeper taught her in her first autumn here, and sets the ladle down and wipes the rim with a damp cloth, turning the jar in her hand and drawing the cloth around the lip in one slow pass so that no trace of jelly remains where the seal will sit. She sets the first jar aside and reaches for the second. The work finds its rhythm quickly. Jar, ladle, pour, wipe. Each jar fills the same way, the golden jelly catching the light differently in each one, depending on where it sits on the table and how the candle flame moves. Some hold a deep, steady warmth, others flicker. She does not rush. The ladle dips and rises and dips again, and the level in the copper pan drops slowly, and the row of filled jars beside her grows. By the fourth jar, her hands have warmed from the heat still held in the jelly, and the glass no longer feels cool when she picks up the next one. By the sixth, the scent of clove and cinnamon has risen fully into the room, and settled there among the dried herbs overhead, so that the air around her is layered and complex and sweet, and she breathes it without thinking about it, the way she breathes the warmth from the range. The seventh jar. The eighth. She scrapes the last of the jelly from the copper pan with the edge of the ladle, tilting the pan toward the candle to see what remains, and pours a final thin stream into the last jar. It is slightly less full than the others, but only just, and she wipes the rim the same way she wiped all the rest and sets it at the end of the row. 8 jars, each one golden and still and warm on the scarred oak table, the candlelight held in each of them like a small, quiet lamp. She sets the empty pan and the ladle in the stone sink to be washed later, and returns to the table and stands for a moment, looking at the row. At the far end of the table, the quince paste sits undisturbed on its stone slab. The damson syrup drips steadily through the muslin in slow, dark drops. The range fire has settled into a low, even burn, and the warmth from it reaches her where she stands and holds her there, steady and close. The sheet of waxed paper is smooth under her fingers when she draws it toward her across the table, and it resists just slightly, the way waxed things do, catching against the grain of the oak before sliding free. She reaches into the drawer at the end of the table and finds the paring knife by feel, its bone handle worn to a shape her hand knows without looking. The blade is short and thin and sharp, and she sets it beside the waxed paper and pulls the candle closer so the light falls directly on her work. She needs circles, small ones, just wide enough to cover the mouth of each jar with a little to spare. She has no template. She has never needed one. The knife tip presses into the waxed paper, and she draws it around in a slow, steady curve, turning the sheet with her other hand as the blade moves, and the circle separates from the sheet with a soft, tearing sound, clean-edged and even. She holds it up to the light, and it is faintly translucent, the wax giving it a milky quality, and she sets it down and cuts the next. 8 circles. Each one takes the same slow turn of the knife, the same soft sound of the blade parting the paper, the same moment of lifting the finished piece away and laying it flat on the table. Her damson-stained fingertips leave faint purple marks on the edges of the first few circles, but the wax does not absorb them, and they sit on the surface like small bruises that she could wipe away if she chose. She does not. They will be hidden beneath the outer cover, and no one will see them. The saucer is next. She takes the small brown bottle of brandy from the shelf above the sink, uncorks it, and pours just enough to cover the bottom of the saucer. A thin pool that catches the candlelight and throws it back, bright and sharp. The smell reaches her at once, clean and burning and warm, cutting through the sweeter scents of fruit and herbs that have filled the room all evening. She sets the bottle aside and picks up the first waxed circle and lays it flat on the surface of the brandy. The paper darkens as the spirit soaks into it, and she counts to 3 under her breath, and then lifts it out and lays it directly onto the surface of the jelly in the first jar, pressing it gently with her fingertip so it sits flat against the golden surface with no air beneath it. The brandy-soaked paper clings to the jelly and seals it, and the smell of the spirit mixes for a moment with the clove and cinnamon rising from the jar before it settles and fades. She moves to the second jar. Dip, lift, press. The same slow count. The same careful placement. The waxed paper darkens each time it touches the brandy, and lightens again as the spirit begins to dry. And by the third jar her fingers are wet with it, and the sharp, warm scent of it is on her hands and in the air around her, threading through the lavender and thyme overhead. Fourth jar. Fifth. She finds she does not need to think about what her hands are doing. The rhythm carries her. The saucer of brandy, the soft paper, the cool glass rim against her fingertip, the candlelight steady on the row of jars, each one now holding its golden contents beneath a thin, sealed skin. The range fire ticks softly behind her, and the damson syrup continues its slow, patient work, each drop falling into the bowl with a sound so small she can only hear it in the spaces between her own movements. Sixth, seventh, eighth. She sets the last waxed circle in place and presses it down and wipes her fingers on the cloth at the table edge. Now the outer covers. The plain paper is heavier than the waxed, a thick cream stock that the housekeeper orders by the ream and stores in the linen cupboard upstairs. She cuts 8 circles with the paring knife, larger this time, wide enough to fold down over the sides of each jar. She dampens each one with a quick pass of a wet cloth, just enough to soften the fibers so the paper will stretch and hold its shape. And then she lays the first circle over the mouth of the first jar and gathers the edges down around the glass with both hands, feeling the damp paper yield and tighten as she smooths it into place. The string she cuts in lengths, each one long enough to wrap twice around the neck of the jar and tie in a flat knot. She ties the first one slowly, pulling it firm but not tight, and tucks the ends neatly against the glass. The paper holds. The jar is sealed. She sets it aside and reaches for the next. By the time the 8th jar is covered and tied, the row has changed. The jars no longer glow with open golden light. They are quieter now, dressed in their cream paper covers with their string ties, like small parcels waiting on the table. The jelly is hidden, and the candlelight falls on paper instead of glass, and the effect is softer, more muted. She rests her hands on the table for a moment and looks at them. These 8 sealed jars standing in a line, and the room feels stiller than it did before, as though the act of closing each one has settled something in the air itself. She turns away from the table and walks to the far end where the quince paste sits on its stone slab. She leans down and presses the surface again with one fingertip. Firmer now. The paste yields less than it did an hour ago, and the slight impression her finger leaves fills in slowly rather than at once. The scent is deeper too, richer, the way quince darkens and sweetens as it cools. She straightens up and wipes her finger on her apron and leaves it to its slow, quiet work. The paring knife she rinses under the tap at the stone sink, the cold water running over the short blade and carrying away the wax and paper dust. She dries it on the cloth and sets it beside the candle where she can find it again. The pen is a plain steel nib set in a wooden holder, the wood darkened and smooth from years of the same hand holding it in the same place. She draws the ink tray toward her and lifts the small glass bottle from its well, uncorks it, and dips the nib. The ink is black and cold and has a faint iron smell that she has always liked, something sharp and clean against the sweetness that fills the rest of the room. The labels are already cut. She did them this morning at the kitchen table, measuring each one against the width of the jars and trimming them with the paring knife until they were all the same size. Neat rectangles of cream paper, no wider than her thumb is long. She takes the first one and lays it flat on the table in front of her, steadying it with the fingers of her left hand, and writes, "Apple Jelly, October 1878. The nib moves slowly. She has never had a rushing hand, and the copper plate the housekeeper taught her when she first came to Hartwell requires a patience that suits her. Each downstroke firm and weighted, each upstroke thin and light. The ink flows evenly, and the letters sit dark and wet on the paper for a moment before they begin to dry at the edges, losing their shine and settling into the grain. She lifts the label and blows across it once, softly, and sets it aside and takes the next. The same words, the same careful, unhurried strokes. By the third label, her hand has found its pace and the letters come more easily. The nib dipping into the ink bottle between each one with a small, precise movement that she does not need to watch. She watches instead the way the candlelight falls across the wet ink as she writes, each letter holding a thin line of gold along its edge before the ink dries and the gold disappears. 8 labels. She lays them out in a row beside the jars and lets them dry while she mixes the paste. The gum arabic is in a small brown jar on the shelf behind her, a pale, brittle resin that dissolves in water if given time and warmth. She scrapes a few pieces into the saucer, which she has emptied and wiped clean of the brandy, and adds water from the jug by the sink, just enough to cover the resin. She stirs it with the handle of the paring knife, working the gum into the water until it thickens into a thin, clear paste that coats the wood and drips from it in slow strings. The first label she lays face down on the table and brushes the paste across the back with one fingertip, covering the paper evenly in a thin, wet layer. She lifts it and turns it over and presses it onto the front of the first jar, smoothing it with her thumb, feeling the damp paper conform to the curve of the glass beneath the outer cover. She holds it there for a moment, her thumb resting on the word October, and then she lets go and the label stays. Second jar. Third. The paste is cool on her fingers and slightly sticky, and it mixes with the damson stain so that her fingertips are now a strange, dark color, purple and amber and faintly shining. She works through the row without pausing, each label pressed into place and held and released, until all 8 jars carry their names. She wipes her hands on the damp cloth and stands back. The ink has dried. The labels are straight. She picks up the first jar in both hands, feeling the weight of it, the solidity of sealed glass and fruit and paper and string, and carries it to the shelves on the far wall. The shelf she chooses is at shoulder height, where the other autumn preserves stand in an ordered row. Gooseberry from July. Red currant from August. A gap at the end where the apple jelly belongs. She sets the jar in its place with a soft, clean sound of glass on wood, and turns the label to face outward, adjusting it with her fingertips until it is straight. She goes back for the next. 2 jars at a time now, one in each hand, the glass cool against her palms. Each one placed beside the last, each label turned. The shelf fills, the row extends. 6 jars, 8. She straightens one of the older jars beside them, a red currant that has sat slightly crooked since she shelved it weeks ago, and turns its label forward too so the row is even. The table is emptier now. The saucer of paste, the pen and ink, the paring knife, the spool of string. The sealed jars gone from their row. The space where they stood is bare oak, scored and stained and warm in the candlelight. The damson syrup has nearly finished. The drops fall less often now, each one hanging from the muslin for a long, slow moment before it releases and falls into the dark pool below. She bends and looks into the bowl. The syrup is clear, deep, almost black, but when the candlelight reaches it, she can see a dark ruby color at the edges, rich and clean. She covers the bowl with a fresh cloth and leaves it for tomorrow. The range fire ticks. The room is warm and still and full of the scent of fruit and dried herbs and the faintest trace of brandy. She unties the spool of string and cuts a fresh length and winds it neatly and returns it to its place in the drawer. The lavender has been drying above the range for 3 days, and when she reaches up and lifts the first bundle from its hook, the stems are brittle and light, and the flower heads crumble slightly under her fingers, releasing a scent so strong and sudden that it fills the space around her hands before it spreads into the wider room. She carries the bundle to the table and sits down on the stool for the first time this evening, and her shoulders settle as the weight goes out of her legs. She strips the flower heads by drawing each stem through her closed fist, letting the small purple-gray buds fall into the wide bowl she has set in front of her. The stems are dry and rough against her palm. The buds are soft, papery, barely there. They gather in the bowl in a loose, fragrant heap, and she works through the bundle steadily, stem by stem, dropping the bare stalks into a pile beside her. The second bundle, the third. Her hands smell of lavender now, layered over the damson and brandy and gum arabic that have already stained them through the evening, and the combination is strange and warm and entirely her own. The bowl fills. The pile of bare stems grows. The muslin bags are small, each one cut and hemmed by the housekeeper on quiet afternoons in the sitting room upstairs. She spoons the lavender into the first bag, holding it open with one hand and filling it loosely, not packing it tight, because the scent carries better when the air can move through. She ties the neck with a length of thread, wrapping it twice and knotting it, and sets the finished bag aside. It is light in her hand, almost weightless. She fills 4 bags, 5, 6, each one tied and set beside the last in a neat row on the table. They will go upstairs tomorrow, tucked between the folded sheets in the linen cupboard, and for weeks afterward, anyone who opens the cupboard door will breathe in this room and this evening without knowing it. She carries the bare stems to the range and opens the iron door and feeds them into the fire. They catch at once, a brief bright flare and a rush of scent, lavender smoke, dry and sweet, and then they are gone and the fire settles back to its low, steady burn. The quince paste. She walks to the far end of the table and presses the surface one last time. Cool. Her fingertip leaves no mark. The paste has set in its frame, dark and smooth, and the scent that rises from it is quieter than before, deeper, as though it too has settled. She wipes the table down with a damp cloth, working from one end to the other in long, slow strokes. The scored oak emerges clean and dark behind the cloth. She rinses the saucer and the pen nib and sets them on the draining board beside the copper pan. The paring knife she dries and returns to its drawer. The range. She closes the draft halfway. The fire will burn through the night on what remains. She unties her apron and folds it, and hangs it on the hook by the door. Her hands are still. The lavender bags on the table, the jars on the shelf, the covered bowl of damson syrup, the quince paste on its stone slab. The candle has burned low. The flame is small and steady. The room holds its warmth the way the jars hold the fruit, quietly, completely, without effort. She stands by the table, the soft tick of the range, the scent of lavender and quince and old wood. The shelves, the stone floor warm under her feet, the still room, the quiet, the warmth.